Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of CNF Talks. Today, very pleased to have with me Ingrid Holmes, who's the Executive Director of the Green Finance Institute. She'll be speaking at the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Summit on the 1st of July in London. Ingrid, welcome.
Thank you, Morris. Delighted to be here. Really looking forward to the conference.
Excellent. Very nice to have you with us. Let's turn to the first question, if we may. What are the scope and scale of the challenges involved in ensuring that the UK is prepared for climate change?
Well, we know we're going to be facing hotter and drier summers, wetter winters, and more storms. And I think we're all aware that, as we've seen, our infrastructure isn't really built to withstand these extremes, so we need to adapt. One of the challenges we're seeing in our engagement with financial market participants is that to date there isn't really that much clarity on what an adapted and resilient society needs to look like. We're not going to be able to eliminate flooding risk to buildings, for example, but we can ensure that people bounce back quicker through ensuring buildings and communities are more adapted and resilient to flooding. So the sorts of things I mean are practical things like keeping waterways and drains clear of debris, moving away from carpeted rooms downstairs where there's a flood risk, putting wiring up high in halls, that sort of thing. But similarly, we know there's going to be disruption to transport infrastructure in extreme heat and flood events. So we need to start thinking about what would constitute a resilient level of service and what that means in terms of the engineered and nature-based solutions we need to deploy to improve resilience. To date, we don't really have clarity on the outcomes we need to be seeking, both as society and as investors. And although there are some estimates of the investment needed, I think the Committee on Climate Change says something in the region of 50 to 100 billion pounds needs to be deployed over the next 10 years. As far as I can tell, these assessments are incomplete. So we just don't really know what the full investment potential and market size actually is.
So it's quite a challenge, but of course, the government does have its National Adaptation Plan, which is now, I believe, in its third iteration. Do you think that that adequately addresses the challenges? And if not, what additional measures would you like to see the government take?
So, I mean, I think the NAP 3 is really what I'd call a plan for a plan. It talks about some of the actions that government is going to take. So we've got some good numbers in there. Investment into water infrastructure is in the region of 2.2 billion, flood and coastal erosion schemes 5.2 billion. But I think, again, it's sort of missing the clarity on the outcomes that we need to be seeking from a societal perspective. And I think that's where we need to go to next. So, you know, private capital is absolutely keen and willing to deploy, but we need to know what good looks like, what's the role of regulation and policy in facilitating effective capital mobilisation. That's going to be really important to mainstream it across the whole of our infrastructure. Otherwise, we risk maladaptation and adverse outcomes as people do their own ad hoc efforts to become more resilient.
I mean, the UK has obviously for a long time been regarded as a leader in its approach to climate change, and probably notwithstanding the recent drawing back a little by the current government. Do you think that perhaps other countries may have overtaken us when it comes to climate adaptation? And if so, are there any policies, adaptation policies, that they are putting into place you think we should have a look at?
Well, I mean, I think absolutely it's always worth looking at what's going on overseas. And of course, some of the most exposed parts of the world, I'm thinking about Latin America, has been having to think about adaptation for a long time. And indeed, our sort of DFID and Foreign Office have been supporting in some of those efforts. But I think closer to home, I think the Dutch are doing some really interesting work, for example, on resilient building stock. Actually, you're seeing collaborations between building experts, financiers and regulators, looking at what good standards might be for our built environment. Similar work going on in the agriculture sector as well. I think we've seen this winter how exposed our farmers are to flooding events. We've actually seen historically really good collaboration between the Dutch and the British Environment Agency, given we face quite similar risks. So I think there's definitely more we could be doing there and leveraging.
Interesting. And I suppose, so far we've been talking about at the, if you like, the macro level of what countries should be doing and what governments should be doing. But at the micro level, what should companies be doing now by way of preparing for climate change accelerating?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, Maurice. The last 9 months, I've been co-chairing the Adaptation Working Group for the Climate Financial Risk Forum. So this is industry working together to understand how we can improve the response to climate change. The work on adaptation is actually very much focused on where the gaps are in physical
Yeah,
risk modelling. And I think what we're seeing is the macro financial risk is well taken care of in these network for greening the financial system scenarios, but actually we need to start looking at the asset level, at the impact of specific hazards on physical risk and adaptation opportunity. And that's really where the work focuses, providing advice and guidance on how you do that next level of detailed analysis, and particularly start thinking about tail risks. I think we have a tendency in the risk management world to focus on medians, but actually it's those extreme events that we need to be preparing for. So my sense is it'll be interesting to see how this guidance lands. We are very much in the foothills of understanding how to do this, but nonetheless, I think the framework we're providing is quite helpful. It basically says retain a focus on aiming for 1.5 degrees, although that in itself is an adaptation framework. We need to budget and build for the current policies, which imply 2 degrees of warming by 2050. And when you're thinking
absolutely.
about critical infrastructure, probably more in the region of 2.5 degrees. So I'm thinking about things like nuclear power stations. You need to be really planning for those contingency events.
Yeah, I mean, if you're saying preparing for 2.5 degrees, that's not really particularly in NAP 3 either, is it? Let alone for
Oh,
people
no.
running their own businesses or large corporates or listed companies. So, do you think that communication is a challenge to get the message across to corporate Britain to prepare?
I think so. I mean, in some ways, it's not a nice message to hear.
Yeah,
But in actual fact, when I think about adaptation, I feel it's quite a hopeful agenda in that we are thinking ahead to what is coming and thinking ahead to collectively how we respond to that, ensure
yeah,
we try to retain our current quality of life, improve resilience, and so on. Um, but yeah, that some of these tools that we've been developing with the forum, this framework for thinking it through, I think should help facilitate those types of conversations that we need to see between corporates and their investors. And I think it also does another really important communication job, which is juxtapose the alternative future if we don't focus on doubling down on mitigation,
yeah,
which I think
yeah.
should help facilitate some of those internal discussions in a way that hasn't happened before.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed that we move forward swiftly on all of this. You mentioned earlier private capital and the role of private capital. Presuming that there's a need for a great deal of collaboration between the public and the private sectors in driving the investment needed for climate adaptation. And around that, there needs to be certainty in the way you're describing earlier as to why people should invest, or what returns they'd have, and why it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I absolutely see the role of the public sector in sort of setting the vision. We've got a vision of net zero by 2050. We need something similar for adaptation. Maybe we're seeking to create a resilient society by 2030, for example, and then
Yeah,
working back to understand the role of basically business interruption risk on the corporate side is a strong driver of investment. But in some sectors, particularly regulated sectors, and we're seeing this in water now, there does need to be a conversation with the regulator to enable the investment needed to happen. And then when I look at the built environment, I think this is going to be about two things: new standards for resilience. We've started to see some of that already with new regulation around having smaller window surface area because we've got an
yeah.
issue with building heating, but we need to think about flood resilience. And then the final point I'd make is there is a really, really important role for the insurance sector here
Mm,
to be
mm,
working more collaboratively, both with governments and with both corporates and banks on innovative risk sharing mechanism. So there's this very much a tendency to just look a year ahead, but we're going to need to move away from, I think, commoditized insurance and start thinking about, well, what is the role of the sector in place-based natural flood management, which might mean that you sell services in a different way, for example. So a lot of work to do and a lot of opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, for our viewers, if you'd like to hear more on this topic, to hear Ingrid and the other exceptional speakers we have at the event, please do have a look at our website, cityandfinancial.com, for further details on the Climate Adaptation Resilience Summit being held in London on the 1st of July. Ingrid, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us.
My pleasure, Maurice.